Hey, Tom.
Hey,
I don't think anybody is joining us at the moment, so I'm going to begin and let them in as things progress. All right. Great. So welcome, I'm Joe Luff, and this is the Theology of Karl Marx, coming to you live from the C. Robbins Clark Library at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Berkeley. To access the seminar syllabus, migrate to newconsensus.org/syllabus. There you will find links to all our readings, as well as to links to the first 4 seminars, actually the first 5 seminars. To learn more, you can email me at josephluff@gmail.com. So our thesis is that Karl Marx erected his critique of modern society around the scaffolding of G.W.F. Hegel's incarnational theology. Christianity is a deeply material, spiritual formation, centered upon the incarnate God, the Palestinian Jew, Jesus. How could it be otherwise? With the turn of the last millennium, however, Christians began to distance themselves from the material character of their faith. They abandoned their religious formations' surface forms of appearance, including the body of their Lord, replacing it with the abstract value form of the commodity. This gave rise to a religious formation far better equipped for a society whose social relations were mediated by commodity production and exchange. Martin Luther celebrated Deus absconditus, the hidden God. Pietists such as Philip Jakob Spener warned Christians not to trust any outward form of appearance, not creeds, confessions, not the Bible, not prayer, not the Holy Eucharist, not even the body of their Lord. Awakening preachers such as Jonathan Edwards celebrated the mortification of the flesh among the spiritually awakened. Christian hostility towards surface forms of appearance left surfaces vulnerable to widespread depredations. Creation proved especially vulnerable, but so too did the bodies of Africans, of women, of the colonized, the poor, the dependent, children, and workers. A Christianity that celebrated an abstract God offered no protection against a social formation bent on extracting the most value from every surface. Officially sanctioned mass death expanded exponentially. Christian thinkers counted the rapid expansion of death and destruction as evidence of God's presence, the presence of eternity in time. They called this violent presence the sublime. We concluded the last seminar by examining G.W.F. Hegel's critique of Immanuel Kant and Edmund Burke's interpretation of the divine presence. God is not hostile to the material world. God created the material world and continues to shape it. Quote, this outward shaping, which is itself annihilated in turn by what it reveals, so that the revelation of the content is at the same time a supersession of the revelation, is what Kant understands by the sublime. For us, however, writes Hegel, this shaping, differing from Kant, we need not place in the pure subjectivity of the mind and its ideas of reason. On the contrary, we must grasp it as grounded in the one absolute substance, as the content which is to be represented. Around this scaffolding, Karl Marx erected his critique of modern society. Today, we dive more fully into Hegel's phenomenology of the spirit and how Marx refashioned Hegel's phenomenology into a critique of modern society. Most people are familiar with this critique, if not in detail, at least in general. Where Hegel had counted God's spirit as the subject of history, Marx replaced this subject with class struggle. It was not God who was realizing God's redemptive plan in history. Rather, was it species being or humanity that was realizing its redemptive plan in history? Where Hegel wrote God and God's spirit, Marx wrote the industrial working class and its spirit. Working class consciousness. Where Hegel's story ends with the return of creation, complete, to God's self, Marx's story ends with the return of humanity, completed to itself. But along the way, something went wrong, deeply wrong. The revolutions of 1848 and 1849, which should have been the beginning of the end, failed miserably. The working class, which should have been the vanguard of history, was entirely ill-suited to assume that role. Was the working class the subject of history? Or was some other spirit driving history forwards? Hey, Walter. We begin by looking at the two sections in Hegel that have caused all these problems, sections 18 and 19. In these sections, Hegel outlined what happens when we truly grasp, truly understand the world around us and our place within it. How do we know that we are not being tricked? Let me first give you an example of what I mean. In July of 1969, human beings blasted off from Earth, traveled to, landed, walked on, blasted off, and returned to Earth from the moon. To do so required exceptional confidence in their highly detailed grasp of physics, the principles that govern material reality. This really happened. But it could not happen in 2000 BCE, or the first century of the Common Era, or during the Renaissance, or the Enlightenment, not in 1950 or in 1960. It could not happen until 1969, approximately 2.4 million years after the first proto-hominid dropped from its canopy onto the savanna plains. Human beings were not born with a detailed map of reality seared into their brains. They had to come to it gradually, not individually, not through thinking hard all by themselves, but collectively in history, in time. How did that happen? This is the question Hegel answers in sections 18 and 19 of his phenomenology. It happens, Hegel tells us, as an act of divine creation. The world and everything in it, creation, is a product of God's differentiating God's self from God's self, the creation of another. This other, though related to God, is not God. Because it is not God, it has true independence, but it is not isolated either. It is in relationship, which means that its relationship to itself, to the world, and to God is iterative. It is becoming aware, becoming conscious, not magically, not all at once, not only in thought, but in time. And among the things it is becoming aware of is its relationship to everything. including its relationship to God. But of course, also a deep enough grasp of the material world to, well, to go to the moon, for example. Not in its imagination, but in fact. So here's what Hegel says. Further, the living substance is being which is in truth subject, or what is the same, is in truth actual only insofar as it is the movement of positing itself, or as the mediation of its self-othering with itself. This substance is, as subject, pure simple negativity. And this is for this very reason, the bifurcation of the simple, God, creation. It is the doubling which sets up opposition, and then again, the negation of this indifferent diversity and of its antithesis. So it's not simply an opposition, it's also a differentiation. Only this self-restoring sameness or this reflection in otherness with itself, not an original or immediate unity as such, is the true. Creation is real. It's not a figment. It is really out there and different from God. It is the process of its own becoming, the circle that presupposes its end as its goal, having its goal also as its beginning, and only by being worked out to its end is it actual. And then, thus the life of God and divine cognition may well be spoken of as a disporting of love with itself. The creation is a product of love. It is love engaging in love with itself. But this idea sinks into mere edification and even insipidity if it lacks the seriousness, the suffering, the patience, and the labor of the negative, which is another way to say it takes time. It doesn't happen all at once.
Mm-hmm.
For German university students 2 centuries ago, this was gold. To be clear, if it takes time, then monarchical claims to divine right and set law cannot be correct. Just as institutions have changed since the beginning, so they are continuing to change. They are completing themselves. But how and to what end? Everyone had an opinion on this topic, including, of course, a very young Karl Marx. So let's first consider what is undoubtedly the best-known passage in Marx's collection. Religion is the opium of the people. The passage literally appears on the first page of the first published article of a 26-year-old Karl Marx. The article's first sentence is telling. The very first published sentence of Karl Marx is, "The criticism of religion is the premise of all criticism." Let that sink in. In order to critique the modern age, one must first critique its religion. From the very first sentence of the first page of his first published work, Marx orients his thinking around religion. If for Hegel, the world and human consciousness is created by God, in Marx's world, God is created by the world. Religion is the self-consciousness, and I'm quoting Marx here. Religion is the self-consciousness and self-esteem of man who has either not yet found himself or has already lost himself again. And yet Marx takes the basic outline of his critique from Hegel. Man is no abstract being encamped outside the world, writes Marx. Religion is the general theory of that world, its encyclopedic compendium, its logic in a popular form, its spiritualistic point d'honneur, its enthusiasm, its moral sanction, its solemn complement, its universal source of consolation and justification. So for anyone who tells you that Marx never took religion seriously, they have never read Marx. But it is also fantastic insofar as it immediately expels this compendium, this logic, from the world into the farthest reaches of heaven. In essence, religion has it right. The struggle against religion, Marx's struggle against religion, is therefore indirectly a fight against the world of which religion is the spiritual aroma. Now think about that for a moment. If religion justifies the violence of the real world by transferring it to heaven, which is what essentially Kant and Burke did, then the struggle against religion is simultaneously a struggle for creation. Religious distress is at the same time, therefore, the expression of real distress and also the protest against real distress. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, just as it is the spirit of spiritless conditions. It is the opium of the people. Less than a year later, Marx, now 27, made the connection between his analysis and Hegel's incarnational theology explicit in what is known as his economic and philosophical manuscripts. For Hegel, wrote Marx, the human being, man, equals self-consciousness. All estrangement of the human being is therefore nothing but estrangement of self-consciousness. The estrangement of self-consciousness is not regarded as an expression, reflected in the realm of knowledge and thought, of real estrangement and of human being. Instead, the actual estrangement, that which appears real, is according to its innermost hidden nature, nothing but the manifestation of the estrangement of the real human essence, self-consciousness. The science which comprehends this is therefore called phenomenology. So Marx is essentially saying what Hegel is doing is he's taking an estranged human being and building a system around it. Hegel counts estrangement to be a feature of the human essence. Estrangement outside of human action arises from estrangement of human being. Marx continues, all reappropriation of the estranged objective essence appears, therefore, as incorporation into self-consciousness. Those who take hold of their essential being are merely the self-consciousness which takes hold of objective essences. Return of the object into the self is therefore the reappropriation of the object. And here, this is simply a midrash on Hegel's passage that we just covered. The circle is being completed, the return of the object into the self. But now this 27-year-old goes beyond Hegel. It is not, he says, the essence of alienated humanity that objectifies and returns to itself. Whenever real corporeal human beings with their feet firmly on the solid ground, human beings exhaling and inhaling the forces of nature, when this human being posits its real, objective, essential power as alien objects of their externalization, it is not the act of positing which is the subject in this process. Hegel, in other words, takes the process as the subject, in which case the real corporeal human beings are the objectification of the divine. For Marx, however, it is human beings that objectify themselves in the world, in their own action, in their work. And it is human beings that reappropriate that which they have made. The estrangement, therefore, is not divine estrangement, but human. Is that clear? Is that?
Makes sense.
Yeah, okay. But this process, says Marx, has been cut short. It's been short-circuited. What human beings have created has not returned to them, at least not to all of them. In fact, what human beings have created has been prevented from returning to their creator. It has been misappropriated, seized, stolen, preventing human beings from realizing themselves. This, of course, is the classic Marxist story. History, which is the history of class struggle, has hit the final barrier to full human realization. Primitive accumulation was superseded by masters and slaves, which was superseded by feudalism, which was superseded by investors and workers. At each stage, the ranks of the oppressed grow and gain more self-awareness. Now, finally, they are fully aware. Only one obstacle stands in their way. For the circle to complete itself, the creators of all value must become the owners of all value. In his Communist Manifesto, Marx described this obstacle as the contradiction between the private forces of production, chiefly private property, and the socialized relations of production, chiefly the industrial working class. To overcome this contradiction, the socialized workers would have to reappropriate the alienated labor seized from them by the owners of private property. This classic Marxist analysis, however, was flawed, and Marx knew it. So I've included among the readings a brief summary of the revolutions of 1848 and 49 to give us a better idea of what happened next. Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto was published in 1848. The same year, revolutions began to break out everywhere on the European continent. Are you guys gone now?
Oh, no, we are here.
Okay. It looks as though Tom has left briefly. Within weeks, these revolutions spread to Europe's colonial holdings in Latin America. But instead of fulfilling their historical destiny, the working classes everywhere were soundly defeated. The thoroughness of their defeat was a severe blow, not simply to democratic process and Republican ideals, but especially to the mistaken notion that the working class represented humanity. If they represented humanity, then humanity had failed. Even more disturbing, once all the dead were buried, the reforms introduced by the owners of private property actually worked.
Oh.
Wages rose, benefits expanded, elections were held, a limited social franchise was adopted, and Europe's economies began to expand. It was a win-win, except for those who had placed their faith in a worker uprising and working class state. They had lost. and that included Marx. So where had he gone wrong? I want to consider this question from two vantage points. First, intuitively, and second, historically. So first, consider what Marx had described, not inaccurately. Over 90% of Europe could now be considered working class, or worse. They could be considered peasants. Their conditions were absolutely abominable: illiterate, malnourished, packed cheek to jowl in tenements teeming with disease. Marx was absolutely right. To raise this mass of human flesh up to the bare minimum of humanity would require the greatest effort and resolve. A greatly reduced working day, sufficient nutrition, healthcare, education, leisure, freedom from fear. To be sure, their penury was the necessary condition for the relative opulence of the few. But the fact that one is sick does not equip one to diagnose or treat one's own disease. Accurate diagnosis and effective treatment requires years of education, good health, security, and training. Europe's working classes and peasants had none of these. Thus, the need for a workers' vanguard, a segment of the educated bourgeoisie willing and able to lead the working classes to victory. But why would the workers trust members of their class enemy to lead them? And how would they know which vanguard they should follow? The simple answer is whichever vanguard fought for their interests. But how would they even know what was in their best interests? If the educated bourgeoisie was best equipped to know, then did this not place the cart before the horse? If the working class was ill-equipped, then what did this say about so-called dialectical materialism? Should the working class violate the laws of history in order to fulfill them? Isn't that the essence of the dictatorship of the proletariat? So intuitively, the victory of the industrial working class makes no sense. Right?
Right.
Historically as well, if the educated bourgeoisie are best equipped to diagnose and respond to what ails society, then this would suggest that the trajectory of history bypasses the working class, or rather that the working classes are not the solution to history, but rather history's problem. Consider for a moment what actually happened after monarchs brutally suppressed the revolutions of 1848 and 49. What actually happened was that the educated bourgeoisie forced their monarchs to implement sweeping reforms in education. They forced their monarchs to implement sweeping reforms in education, healthcare, trade, old age benefits, and most significant of all, entry into the civil service and military. This resulted in higher wages, better health, and greater access for working families to the benefits of their labor. One way to understand these decades of peace and prosperity, which lasted into the 1890s, is that capitalism is self-correcting. Yes, there were decades of decline in economic and social turbulence, but eventually capital found a way to leverage these dire circumstances to its own advantage and the advantage of the many. expanding opportunities everywhere. This could suggest that capital plays no favorites. Capital wants only to expand. Sometimes this is at the expense of workers. Sometimes this is at the expense of investors. But whatever the case, value will find a way. But this means that the real driver of history is neither investors nor workers, but value itself and its insatiable drive to expand. Is that clear?
Yes.
Any questions or?
Value. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to share a screen here, if I can find it. There it is. There.
Yep, got it.
Good. So to illustrate this drive to expand, I want to share a chart with you. It is not my own. It was produced several decades ago by my University of Chicago colleague, Robert E. Lucas, Jr. It shows the percentage of economies in the world enjoying growth decade by decade since 1800. On its face, this chart simply shows the fraction of the world's economies enjoying economic growth. For Lucas, it illustrates the knock-on effect. As communities bring their laws and regulations and institutions into line with one another, as they engage in more trade with one another, as they open up their markets, this has a knock-on effect. Local laws and customs and institutions are abandoned. Producers adopt a common language. The world becomes smaller, more integrated, more rational, more efficient, more peaceful. But at what cost? In Seminar 4, we looked at the exploding number of casualties in officially sanctioned mass death. At that time, we limited our focus to Christian Europe. Christians killing Christians in unprecedented numbers. But remember, this was the age of empire. Millions upon millions were being slaughtered across the globe in the name of Christ and progress. Age-old local institutions, customs, and practices were being razed to the ground to make it easier for investors to exploit local labor and resources. This is certainly another way to look at Lucas's growth chart, right? That as we eliminate the particularities in each community, really eliminate them, including eliminating people, labor and resources are able to expand. Back to the theology of Karl Marx. The revolutions of 1848 and 49 and their aftermath dealt a severe blow to Marx's interpretation of history. The working class had not seized the day. Where still the educated bourgeoisie had forced their monarchs to enact sweeping reforms that seemingly benefited all. Now, remember that Marx had faulted Hegel for his phenomenology of the spirit. Marx had argued that it was not the divine spirit, but the human spirit that was alienating itself and was destined to return to itself. Was Marx mistaken, or was Hegel? The first hint of an answer to this question came in notebooks, piles composed between 1858 and 1862, Marx's Grundrisse, or outline. Outline for what? Well, it was for his upcoming work called Capital. In this outline, Marx completely abandoned his labor-centered view of history. Labor was as much the product of capital as the bourgeoisie. Both were subject to a force much bigger than themselves. In Marx's words, quote, and I'm quoting from the Grundrisse here, labor is not only the use value which confronts capital, but rather it is the use value of capital itself. As the not being of values insofar as they are objectified, labor is their being insofar as they are not objectified. It is their ideal being, the possibility of values, and as activity, the positing of value. So here, labor is the embodiment of value, not in a good sense, but in the sense of capital itself. And if labor is the embodiment and source of value in capital, it cannot undermine capital without undermining itself. Quote, the substance of value is not at all the particular natural substance, but rather of objectified labor. This means, however, that the agent or actor, the subject driving history forward, is neither investors nor workers, not God, not man. Rather, both investors and workers are being driven forwards by an abstract, quasi-rational consciousness, which Marx is now able to identify as the abstract value form of the commodity. The trail of notebooks, the Grundrisse, ends in 1862. They are not discovered until a box of old manuscripts is unearthed in the 1930s in what is now the Soviet Union. When in 1867, Marx's magnum opus appears, his Das Kapital, party members had already decided what it must say. They therefore failed to notice that between 1848 and 1867, 20 years, Marx had shifted away from the industrial working class and also away from violent revolution. No one cared about the influence of Hegel that Hegel had on Marx's thinking, and certainly no one cared about Marx's theology. No one noticed the profound theological implications of Marx's new analysis. So I'm just going to give a very short summary here because the next step is kind of critical. We need to recall Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. God's self differentiates itself from itself. God's spirit alienates itself in creation. Consciousness and historical development are expressions of God's unfolding in history. God is completing God's self and completing creation in history. Recall as well how the young Marx interpreted Hegel's incarnational theology. It was not God, but human beings who were differentiating themselves and objectifying themselves in history through their labor. It was not God who was returning to God's self, but the alienated labor of workers. Now listen to Marx in Volume 1 of Capital. Value is constantly changing from one form into the other without becoming lost in this movement. It thus becomes transformed into an automatic subject. Value becomes this self-moving subject. If we pin down the specific forms of appearance assumed in turn by self-valorizing value in the course of its life, we reach the following elucidation. Capital is money, capital is commodities. In truth, however, value is here the subject of a process in which, while constantly assuming the form in turn of money and commodities, it changes its own magnitude, throws off surplus value from itself, considered as original value, and thus valorizes itself independently. Mm-hmm. But now in the circulation of money, commodities back into money, value suddenly presents itself as a self-moving substance which passes through a process of its own, and for which commodities and money are both mere forms. So if we are watching money and commodities, including the commodity of labor, we're missing the real drama. The real drama happens in abstract value and its differentiation into these outward forms of appearance. But there is more to come, writes Marx. Instead of simply representing the relations of commodities, it now enters into a private relationship with itself, as it were. And here, Marx is clearly riffing on Hegel's statement about divine love disporting with itself, right? In Hegel, this is love, this is God disporting or playing with itself, having this relationship with itself. In Marx, it is the value form of the commodity that is engaging in this play. Or, as Marx continues, it differentiates itself as original value from itself as surplus value, just as God the Father differentiates himself as God the Son, although both are of the same age and form, in fact, one single person. So again, even after 20 years, Marx returns back to the preface of Hegel's phenomenology. And he now sees that this incarnational theology was always already, in fact, a story about the value form of the commodity. If that's so, then his own story about the working class in the Communist Manifesto was also a story about the value form of the commodity. So now it becomes clear why he could not simply take the industrial working class as the agent of history. The industrial working class for Marx now is as much an expression of the value form as any other commodity. Is that clear?
Yeah.
It's a real problem, not least for Marx. So if Marx is right, then the disembodied God who sprang up in the 14th century, the God who disavowed its own body and disavowed divine materiality, this God is identical to the value form of the commodity.
Mm.
It is the self-moving substance that is subject, which suggests that modern Christianity, pretty much everywhere, is an expression of the abstract value form. So Marx erected his critique of modern society around Hegel's incarnational theology. Hegel's incarnational theology is a misrecognized instance of the movement of abstract value into creation. If that's right, also, then Christianity prior to the 14th century, prior to its commodification, is not subject to Marx's attack. Because Christianity prior to the 14th century believes in, embraces God's body. Discussion, questions? Anything?
Good.
Well, next Sunday, we move ahead a little bit because even though Marx has now pretty much abandoned his youthful embrace of the industrial working class and of violent revolution, he is still very much an observer of economic crisis, which could give rise to change. And so next week, we are going to talk about Marx's eschatology, his understanding of how this all plays out in the future, how it might play out.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So if there are no other questions, I appreciate your joining me today. If you want to get a head start on next Sunday, the readings are all there online in the syllabus online, and I urge you to take a look at them. They're not very long, but they are interesting. Thank you all for joining me.
Thank you.
Hope to see you next week.
All right.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Gilbert.
Best.
Best.
Best.